Imagine a world without Windows, without Microsoft Office, without the personal computer sitting on every desk, in every school, in every pocket. Imagine a world where software was an afterthought, where the real power lived in the machine, the hardware, the cold steel and copper of the thing itself. That was the world of 1975. And into that world stepped a 19-year-old kid from Seattle, pale, intense, bespectacled, who had seen something no one else had seen yet. Not a gadget, not a hobby kit, a revolution. He was not the most charismatic man in the room. He was not the most polished. He was, by most accounts, abrasive, obsessive, and relentless to the point of exhaustion, his own and everyone else's. But he possessed something rarer than charm. He possessed clarity, a kind of cold, crystalline vision that cut through the noise of the moment and saw decades into the future. He would build the most valuable company on earth. He would help reshape how human beings communicate, work, and think. And then, in an act that stunned the business world, he would walk away from it all and dedicate his life to solving the hardest problems humanity has ever faced: poverty, disease, and death itself. His name is Bill Gates, and this is his story. Welcome to Visionary Chronicles. What you are about to hear is not a simple rags to riches tale. Bill Gates did not come from nothing, but what he did with what he had, and what he chose to do with everything he earned, is one of the most complex, contradictory, and ultimately extraordinary stories in modern history. We will take you back to a private school in Seattle in 1968, where a 13-year-old boy pressed his face against the glass of a computer terminal and felt something click into place deep inside him, something that would never stop clicking. We will walk with him through the corridors of Harvard, where he was supposed to become a lawyer like his father, but where he instead spent his nights hunched over code, dreaming of something bigger. We will stand with him in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the bitter cold of January 1975, when he made a phone call that would change everything. We will sit in the room where he negotiated the deal that made Microsoft a colossus, a deal so audacious, so perfectly timed, that it has been called the greatest business transaction of the 20th century. And we will follow him into his second act, not the boardroom, but the field hospitals of sub-Saharan Africa, the rice paddies of Bangladesh, the villages where children were dying of diseases that cost pennies to prevent. This is the full story, the genius, the ruthlessness, the reinvention, and the reckoning. William Henry Gates III was born on October 28, 1955, in Seattle, Washington, a city that smelled of rain and timber and the ambition of people who had come to the edge of the continent and decided to build something there. His father, William Gates II, was a prominent attorney. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was a school teacher turned civic leader, sharp-minded and socially forceful, the kind of woman who commanded any room she entered. The family was comfortable, upper middle class, educated, connected. Bill was the middle child, sandwiched between two sisters, and from early on he was marked by a restless, competitive intelligence that did not always make him easy to be around. He read encyclopedias for fun. He devoured books the way other children devoured cereal. His family called him Trey, a nickname for the third, and noted that he seemed always to be somewhere else in his mind, working through a problem, sorting something out, racing toward an answer that no one else had thought to look for yet. In 1968, when Gates was 13 years old, the Lakeside School, the elite private school he attended in Seattle, made a decision that would alter the course of technology history. The Mothers Club used proceeds from a rummage sale to purchase time on a General Electric computer terminal, a clunking machine connected via telephone line to a mainframe miles away. For most students, it was a novelty. For Bill Gates, it was an awakening. He was transfixed. He spent every spare moment at that terminal, learning the programming language BASIC, pushing the machine to its limits, staying long after other students had gone home. His teachers noted, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that he seemed to understand the computer intuitively, not just how to use it, but how to think with it, how to bend it to his will. It was at Lakeside that Gates met Paul Allen, a gangling, good-natured boy 2 years his senior who shared his obsession. Where Gates was intense and combative, Allen was imaginative and expansive. Where Gates drilled down, Allen looked outward. Together, they were something more than the sum of their parts, a partnership forged in the glow of a cathode ray screen that would, in time, reshape the world. They were not just enthusiasts. They were entrepreneurs almost immediately. At 15, Gates and Allen co-founded a company called Traf-O Data, which built a small computer to analyze road traffic data for Seattle city planners. It was not a spectacular success, but it was real. It generated real revenue, and it taught Gates something he would carry for the rest of his life. That software, the instructions, the code, the invisible logic, was where the true leverage lived. In 1973, Gates enrolled at Harvard University. His parents hoped he would follow his father into law. Harvard itself seemed to agree, admitting him on the strength of a near-perfect SAT score of 1590 out of 1600. But Gates was already somewhere else. He took math courses, computer science courses, and courses in economics. He played poker obsessively, studying probabilities with the same ferocity he brought to everything else. He slept erratically, ate poorly, and spent hours in the university's computer lab while his dormmates slept. Paul Allen had moved to Boston, working at Honeywell, and the two of them were still talking about computers constantly, about where the technology was going, about what it would mean when it reached ordinary people, about the extraordinary future that was rushing toward them like a freight train. Then, in January 1975, Allen was walking through Harvard Square when he stopped dead in front of a newsstand. The cover of Popular Electronics magazine showed a small metal box, the Emmetz Altair 8800, with a headline that declared it the world's first mini-computer kit. The machine had no software. It had no keyboard. It could barely do anything at all. But Allen saw what Gates would see when he ran back to the dorm and thrust the magazine in front of him. The beginning. The absolute, undeniable beginning. Gates looked at that cover and felt the ground shift beneath him. He knew, with the certainty of someone who has spent years preparing for a moment without knowing what that moment would look like, that if someone did not write the software for this machine, and for every machine like it that would follow, the future would belong to whoever did. He picked up the phone. The call Gates made was to Emmetz, the small Albuquerque company that had built the Altair 8800. He told them he had a version of BASIC ready to run on their machine. This was, to put it plainly, a lie. He had no such thing, but he had the confidence, or the audacity, to believe he could build it before anyone found out. Over the next 8 weeks, Gates and Allen worked with ferocious intensity, writing a BASIC interpreter from scratch for a machine they had never physically touched, simulating its Intel 8080 processor on Harvard's computers. When Allen flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate the software, neither of them had any idea if it would actually work. It worked perfectly, on the first try. MIT's licensed the software. Gates dropped out of Harvard. And in April 1975, William Henry Gates III and Paul Allen founded a company they called Microsoft, later shortened to Microsoft. Gates was 19 years old. They set up shop in Albuquerque, close to MIT's, working in a small office with a handful of employees whom Gates drove with the same pitiless intensity he directed at himself. He was known to review every line of code his programmers wrote, to challenge every decision, to ask, with genuine ferocity, "Why isn't this better?" He slept under his desk. He memorized his employees' license plates to monitor who arrived early and who left late. He was, by any reasonable measure, a difficult man to work for. He was also brilliant, and the people around him knew it, and that knowledge kept them in the room. In 1979, Microsoft moved to Bellevue, Washington, near Seattle. The company was growing, and Gates had the instincts of someone who understood not just technology, but the ecosystem around it, the deals, the licensing agreements, the leverage points. He was, at 23, already thinking like a strategist, not just a programmer. Then came 1980, and the deal that would make everything. IBM, the colossus of the computing world, a company so dominant it was called Big Blue, a company whose name was synonymous with corporate power, had decided to build a personal computer. They needed an operating system. They approached Digital Research, the company that owned CP/M, the dominant operating system of the era. The negotiations collapsed. Someone at IBM, perhaps on the recommendation of Mary Gates, who sat on the same charity board as an IBM executive, suggested they talk to Microsoft. Gates did not have an operating system. What he had was something better. He knew where to find one. He purchased a program called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a Seattle programmer named Tim Patterson for approximately $50,000. He did not tell Patterson what it was for. He licensed it to IBM as MS-DOS, retaining the rights to license the same software to other manufacturers. This last detail, the retention of licensing rights, was the master stroke. IBM agreed because they believed the money was in the hardware, in the machines, and they did not think to fight for exclusive control of the software. It was the assumption of an era. It was also the most expensive mistake in business history. As IBM's PC became the standard, and as other manufacturers built machines that ran IBM-compatible software, Microsoft's MS-DOS became the operating system for the entire industry. Not just IBM. Everyone, every clone, every competitor, every company that wanted to sell a personal computer had to come to Microsoft. The money flowed in torrents. By the mid-1980s, Microsoft was the most important software company on Earth. Gates was not satisfied. He was already looking at the next thing, which was the graphical user interface, the windows, icons, and mouse-driven interactions that Apple had pioneered with its Macintosh in 1984. Microsoft launched Windows 1.0 in 1985. It was not impressive, but Gates kept iterating, kept pushing, kept demanding more. Windows 3.0, released in 1990, was a phenomenon. Windows 95, released with a marketing campaign so lavish that it featured the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up, sold 7 million copies in its first 5 weeks and made the personal computer a fixture of everyday life around the world. Microsoft went public in 1986. Gates became a billionaire at 31, the youngest in American history at that time. He was relentless, he was competitive, and he was winning in ways that were beginning to attract attention from people other than admirers. The business tactics that had made Microsoft great were also, critics argued, The tactics of a bully. Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with Windows in the 1990s, effectively suffocating Netscape, which had pioneered the browser market. The company used its dominance in operating systems to squeeze competitors in adjacent markets. In 1998, the United States Department of Justice, joined by 20 state attorneys general, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. The trial was one of the most dramatic in corporate history. Gates gave a deposition that was widely mocked. He appeared evasive, hair-trigger defensive, splitting semantic hairs under questioning in a way that made even his supporters wince. In 2000, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ruled that Microsoft had violated antitrust law and ordered the company broken up into two separate entities. Microsoft appealed. The ruling was ultimately overturned on procedural grounds, and a settlement was reached that required the company to share its application programming interfaces with third-party companies, a significant but survivable outcome. But the antitrust battle had cost Gates something harder to measure than market share. It had cost him his image. The brilliant young visionary had become, in the public mind, something closer to a monopolist, a man who had clawed his way to the top and then pulled the ladder up behind him. On January 13, 2000, Bill Gates stepped down as CEO of Microsoft. Steve Ballmer, his college friend and longtime deputy, took the role. Gates remained as chairman and as the company's chief software architect. The world assumed he would continue to shape Microsoft from behind the scenes. They were only half right. Something else was happening, something quieter, and in many ways far more significant. In 2000, Bill and Melinda Gates merged two existing charitable foundations into a single entity, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It was established with an initial endowment of $28 billion, at the time the largest charitable gift in the history of philanthropy. The stated mission was to address the greatest inequities in the world. The ambition was staggering. The resources to match it were unprecedented. Gates approached global health the same way he had approached software, with data, with intensity, and with an absolute intolerance for vagueness. He read everything. He traveled to places most billionaires would never see. He sat in the offices of epidemiologists and vaccine researchers and public health officials and asked them the questions that no one else was asking, not because he wanted to be seen asking them, but because he genuinely needed to know the answers. What he found appalled him. Children were dying, hundreds of thousands of them, every year, from diseases that could be prevented for a few dollars. Polio, malaria, measles, rotavirus. These were not mysteries. The solutions existed. The vaccines existed. What did not exist was the will, the money, and the distribution infrastructure to deliver them to the children who needed them most. The Gates Foundation set out to change that. In partnership with the World Health Organization and national governments, it committed billions of dollars to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. When Gates became involved, there were roughly 350,000 cases of polio annually. By 2023, that number had fallen to fewer than 25 recorded cases of wild poliovirus worldwide. The disease that had paralyzed Franklin Roosevelt and terrified a generation of American parents was, thanks in significant part to Gates, on the verge of being eliminated from the earth entirely. The Foundation's work on malaria was equally transformative. It funded the distribution of hundreds of millions of insecticide-treated bed nets across sub-Saharan Africa. A simple, cheap, devastatingly effective intervention that saved an estimated 2 to 3 million lives in its first decade alone. It funded research into new malaria vaccines, including the development of RTS-S, the world's first malaria vaccine to be approved for broad use in children. Gates also became one of the central forces behind the Gavi Alliance, the vaccine initiative that has immunized more than 1 billion children since its founding in 2000, preventing an estimated 14 million deaths. He funded agricultural research to develop drought-resistant crops for smallholder farmers in Africa. He invested in sanitation technology, in financial services for the unbanked, in new models for delivering education to the world's poorest communities. In 2010, Gates and Warren Buffett, his close friend and, in some ways, his philosophical mirror, launched the Giving Pledge, a campaign asking the world's billionaires to commit at least half their wealth to philanthropy, either during their lifetimes or in their wills. Within 15 years, more than 230 of the world's wealthiest individuals had signed. The movement Gates and Buffett started had redirected hundreds of billions of dollars toward the world's most pressing problems. Gates himself went further. He committed to giving away more than 90% of his wealth during his lifetime. He stepped down from Microsoft's board of directors in 2020 to focus full-time on the foundation. The man who had once been the richest person on Earth was systematically dismantling his own fortune. In 2021, Gates and Melinda French Gates announced their divorce after 27 years of marriage. The split, which came after scrutiny of Gates's past associations and behavior, was painful and public. Melinda Gates departed the foundation in 2024, and Gates continued its work. The foundation's endowment, despite decades of giving, remained above $50 billion, in part because of continued contributions from Warren Buffett, who had pledged the bulk of his Berkshire Hathaway shares to the Gates Foundation. Gates also turned his attention to climate change, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in clean energy startups through his venture fund, Breakthrough Energy. He wrote a book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, published in 2021, that became a bestseller and helped focus public attention on the specific technological and policy interventions required to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The man who had once been vilified as a monopolist had become, in the eyes of many, the most consequential philanthropist of his age. His legacy was no longer simply Windows or MS-DOS or the browser wars. It was children who had survived malaria because of a bed net. It was villages where polio would never come. It was a generation of smallholder farmers who could feed their families through a drought because of a seed variety that Gates's money had helped develop. What do we take from the life of Bill Gates? What are the lessons that survive the passage of time, the collapse of easy narratives, the complicated humanity of the man himself? The first lesson is the power of seeing what others refuse to see. In 1975, the entire computing industry believed that the future was hardware. The machines were the product. The software was the manual that came in the box. Bill Gates looked at the same landscape as everyone else and saw something different. He saw that software was not the instruction book. It was the engine. He saw that whoever controlled the code would control the machine, and whoever controlled the machine would control the market, and whoever controlled the market would control the future. He was right when almost no one else was, and he staked everything on that insight. The willingness to trust a vision that others cannot yet see, and to act on it with full commitment, is perhaps the rarest and most valuable quality a person can possess. The second lesson is about the relationship between focus and excellence. Gates was not a well-rounded person. He did not have many hobbies. He did not maintain a careful work-life balance. He was, by his own admission and by the testimony of everyone who worked with him, consumed by the problem in front of him, to the exclusion of almost everything else. This monomaniacal focus produced extraordinary results, but it also produced a man who, in his own telling, missed things, relationships, moments, the texture of ordinary life. The lesson is not that you should emulate his extremism. The lesson is that the depth of your commitment shapes the height of your achievement, and that every person must decide for themselves where along that spectrum they are willing to live. The third lesson is about reinvention. Gates built one of the greatest companies in history and then walked away from it, not because he was pushed, not because he had failed, but because he recognized that the next challenge was larger and more important. He took the same analytical intensity, the same refusal to accept vagueness, the same demand for measurable outcomes that had made Microsoft great, and he applied it to global health. He did not retire. He pivoted. He asked himself what the world needed most, and whether he was the person best positioned to provide it. This willingness to reinvent oneself entirely, to shed the identity that the world has assigned you and reach for something new, is one of the most difficult things a human being can do. Gates did it at 44, at the height of his fame and power. That required a kind of courage that the word genius does not capture. The fourth lesson is about the relationship between wealth and responsibility. Gates accumulated a fortune that at its peak exceeded $100 billion. He could have kept it. Many people in his position have. Instead, he concluded, and has argued publicly and at length, that extreme wealth carries with it extreme obligation, that the accident of being born with a particular kind of mind, in a particular country, at a particular moment in history, and the luck of the market that allowed that mind to generate such extraordinary returns did not entitle him to that wealth in any moral sense. It simply gave him the opportunity and the responsibility to use it well. Whether or not you agree with every decision he has made, this is a posture worth examining. In a world of growing inequality, the question of what the fortunate owe to the less fortunate is one of the defining moral questions of our time. The fifth and final lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable: that greatness and goodness do not always travel together, and that a person can be both more flawed and more consequential than any simple story can contain. Gates was ruthless in business. He was at times arrogant, dismissive, and wrong. The antitrust case against Microsoft raised legitimate questions about the health of competitive markets. His personal life has been marked by failures he has publicly acknowledged. And yet, the children who did not die of malaria are real. The villages where polio has not come are real. The scientists whose research was funded, the farmers whose harvests survived, the mothers who watched their children grow up, all of that is real, and it would not exist without him. We do not have to choose between the whole truth and the inspiring narrative. We can hold both. We can learn from the vision and the drive and the reinvention, and we can learn equally from the cost, the relationship strained by obsession, the competitors crushed by market power, the years that cannot be reclaimed. Bill Gates looked at the world and saw a series of problems waiting to be solved. He spent his first 50 years solving some of them. He has spent the years since then solving others. And whatever we think of the man, whatever revisions history may yet demand of our judgment, the scale of what he has attempted and the scale of what he has achieved places him in a category that very few human lives have occupied. He dropped out of Harvard. He bet everything on an insight that most people could not see. He built an empire, he gave it away, and he is still working. This has been Visionary Chronicles.